AFK them, but can he kill Patriot?
No, he's just a physical guy, right? He can't do anything with... Oh, wait. Oh. He can lower the defense. I see.
Got him.
That was pretty cool, actually. Hey.
Bellone. He's a brawler, or I guess the official name is fighter. This is an archetype whose last 6-star was released 3 years ago, and that was Chen, who, despite being a good 6-star, doesn't really stray too far from how Mountain is used. They're both mostly used because of their AFK skills and low DP cost, which allows you to deal with stronger early waves. But we've since gotten stronger ops that either give you a ton of DP on one side, so you can deploy your stronger ops faster, or ones that just have straight up broken AFK skills on the other, so they can easily replace these niche brawlers had. And this is actually a positive aspect of Bellone's kit. It isn't focused on AFK, and the only skill lineage that leans towards that, his S1, is far from being his main one. What it does is what you see on screen. It's an offensive recovery skill that costs 3 SP and just makes his next attack do 250% of his attack as physical damage and strike twice. Despite how simple it is, this is actually a surprisingly competent skill in what it does. First, because he's a brawler, so Bellone attacks very fast normally, which makes charging S1 and spamming it a breeze. Second is because of his talent one. What it does is make so every time he hits an enemy, that attack will reduce their defense, which can scale to a minus 40% defense reduction after just 5 hits with his module, on top of increasing his damage as their HP drops, up to a 142% damage bonus with his module when they are below 20% HP. Both of these things combined with the very short cycle on his attacking mobs actually make this skill work better than you'd expect given its simplicity, and Bellone can even perform better than Mountain and compete with Chongyue against high defense elites because of the talent, but this ends up not being as good as them in the end, mostly because it doesn't have the same utility as the others, by which I'm mainly referring to being able to hit multiple enemies. Mountain can increase his block and target count, on top of gaining self-heal. Chongos can splash his damage to other mobs near his target and has increased range, so when against groups of enemies they tend to perform better in situations where Bellone gets overwhelmed by mobs. Like I said though, this is far from being his main skill, which is how it gets you rest. This is by far the best skill in his kit because it takes full advantage of his talent one. What it does is increase his range to the shape you see on screen, gives him plus 80 attack speed, his attacks now hit 3 targets for 200% of his attack, and most importantly it increases how many times he can stack his defense reduction from 5 to 8 times, on top of applying an 80% movement speed reduction to mobs once they reach the 8 stacks. In total, this skill can reduce a mob's defense by 64%, so it's currently the strongest defense debuff in the game, and that's without even mentioning all the other stuff like his personal damage and massive slow. All that on an extremely cheap cost of 22 SP makes so he can spam SU quite freely, especially if you bring SP batteries or is inside IS with all the relics to charge him up. He can even deal with enemies like Patriot, who has 45k HP and 2.1k defense all by himself with it. Well, it's because this is a comparative list, and if I'm going to compare him with the others, then I need to show something like this. What you just saw was 874 Patriot, who has 15k more HP than the normal version. Now, you might get the urge to scream that I'm comparing a brawler who debuffs with Wangsadel, and you'd be correct if that was what I'm doing. But the point here is not to say that she deals more damage than him. I could switch her up with Wilner or Sakiko and the point would still remain the same. That is to say that debuffing is just not required. Every 6-star DPS op is basically expected to function by themselves nowadays. This isn't year 1 or Patriot was a genuinely threatening up. Nowadays it's just a punching bag to showcase new ops. So Bellone's S2's main strength is quite literally a niche that hasn't been relevant for years at this point and can be easily replaced by ops like Shamir's, since even if her doll isn't as strong as his debuff, it is still a lot more flexible and versatile. And if you want to talk about more relevant ops, you can also use a buffer like a monster and usually get either a similar or better result. That's not really a problem with the skill itself. S2 is very good at what it does, but when one of its main strengths is not that relevant, it ends up serving more his personal damage than the rest of the team. At which point, if we're to compare it to other ops, which is the purpose of this list, it becomes replaceable. And then we get to his S3, which... is a weird skill. See, S3 is very tied to his talent too, and as you can see on screen, what he does is give him an 80% chance of dodge on deploy, which gradually decreases over the course of 20 seconds until he reaches the lower limit of 40%. From this description, you should be able to guess what the problem of a skill that relies on it is. RNG. The way S3 works is that Bellone will get a big attack buff, more attack speed, and have a 50% chance to increase his damage even more every time he attacks. All these buffs are here just to make him more lethal, something they're very good at. Combine them with his talent one, and when Bellone starts going, he can easily shred through most mobs in the game. The issue here comes from this portion of the skill. It makes so Bellone will teleport towards the mob closest to the blue box inside this area whenever he isn't blocking anyone. It's the same type of teleport you see on Pianus S3, and it compensates his extremely short range. The reason they designed this skill this way is because of how talent 2 works. If you remember, he has an 80% dodge only on deploy that then gradually decreases. It might look like a weird way to go about it, but it makes a lot more sense when you realize that every time he teleports to block a mob, that does count as a new deploy, meaning that every new jump he makes resets the dodge chance all the way up to 80%. This is an issue because that's quite literally the only survivability option in his S3. Yes, but given the chance, Mjolnir Sakeko and Wangsadel won't literally teleport on top of a boss, since S3 almost forces Bellone to block whatever target he's facing, and all the protection he has is only his talent, so you're quite literally at the mercy of RNG every time you try using it to kill a strong mob. And it doesn't help that a portion of his damage is also another RNG check. It's actually made worse because the dodge decreases over time, so the stronger a boss is, the less protection Bellone will have because it'll take longer to kill them and therefore decrease his dodge chance even more. It is possible to manipulate this skill such as he won't teleport, like for instance if his target is on top of an undeployable tile, or if you're against giant bosses since they can't be blocked, but now you're very reliant on map design to help him out and quite literally fighting against this skill itself to make it work. Another problem is the way the teleport works. It doesn't have any priority. Bellone will just go to whoever is closest to the blue box, meaning he can very easily get distracted and waste his attacks on trash instead of who you want, which kinda kills the point of him having this huge area coverage to compensate only being able to hit one tile ahead of him in certain maps. This actually can be positive depending on who he targets, since he might be able to quickly kill trash mob to then go back to the main target, which would refresh his dodge, but then again you're relying on map design to help him do a job other ops can without all this getting in the way. So on one side you have a very deadly skill that works really well once everything falls in place, but at the same time it almost feels like it was designed to be difficult to use and ultimately reliant on RNG to reach its full potential. A saving grace here is that Bellone won't get retreated if he dies while on S3, instead the game will just throw him back to his original tile, but if he couldn't kill what you wanted, then that's more of a consolation prize than anything. Because of all that and his S2 being replaceable, I'm ranking him at the bottom. But as it's always the case with these videos, this is simply a comparative list, so just because someone is at the bottom like this goober, it doesn't mean they're bad. In fact, I don't think Hyperglyph has made a single bad 6-star for years at this point in terms of being able to make someone you like clear content. I'm saying all this because a lot of what I said about him was negative, since I do need to justify why the others are ranked above. For now though, if you're worried about meta, he is an escape.
代償だ。
Okay, Dumbo. Can she kill the bear?
Well, she's Russian, the bear's Russian, no Russia. Or is it no Russian? You can look at those numbers. That she just needs to, you know,
There you go, Dumbo.
that was kind of weak actually.
Next up is Zima. She is the next 6-star Earthshaker will get, and since the last one we got was Pepe more than a year ago, you'd probably expect Zima to power creep her in almost every way. That assessment isn't wrong, but it's not that accurate either. Now, you might think I'm fake posting for the sake of video retention. And you're correct. But either way, I still need to show her key to explain what I mean by that, so let's start with her talent one. The first thing it does is make so the AoE damage on her trait is increased by plus 40% when you have her module. And if you don't know what that is, basically on top of the damage Earthshakers deal to the main target of their bonks, they also deal 50% of their attack as AoE damage to all the mobs around it, so the first part increases that damage even further. It's after that comes the main effect of this talent though. It makes so whenever that AoE damage hits a ranged tile, that same tile will act as a sort of conduit and deal damage equal to 24% of her attack to every mob around it, on top of also inflicting a slow on them for 0.5 seconds. So basically you can think of it as Zima being able to send shockwaves of her attacks to every ranged tile around her hits land. That way she can both reach enemies outside her attack range as well as increase her output, because the shockwaves can stack with Zima's normal attacks, and the more ranged tiles you manage to have around your main target, the more damage she deals, since its shockwaves deal damage independently from each other. This is especially good when you can apply Zima close to the edges of a stage, because the shockwaves can also spread through the walls at the borders of a map, so you don't even need to just rely on ranged tiles for this, and she makes a really good use of it on S2. It's a very simple skill as you can see, it just increases her range, gives her plus 90% attack and plus 60% defense, with those values doubling after the second activation and the skill gaining an unlimited duration from then on. Basically the same kind of skill you've seen before on ops like Thorns or Typhon. But it also has a very unique passive where every time Zima triggers a shockwave from her talent, she will gain 1 SP. Normally this wouldn't be that crazy of an effect, but it is in Zima's case. First because S2 costs 50 SP, so any better you can get to help speed the second activation up is very welcome. But second because just like how her shockwaves can stack to deal more damage, this extra SP also works in the same way, and the more range tiles you have around her hits land, the more SP Zima gets per attack. So depending on where you deploy her, Zima can supercharge her skill very fast and get to the second activation at the very start of some stages. And after that there's really nothing much to say. Being an Earthshaker means Zima has a very high base attack, and if you remember her shockwaves scale off of that, so giving her so much extra attack, which can go past 4k on the second activation, both makes her attacks hit really hard and buffs her shockwaves. So not only is she a great option to hold down a lane, being able to go through even some bosses, but if you also manage to get some mobs nearby, her shockwaves will make her job even easier. This is simply one of the best AFK skills in the game right now. Really the only weakness is a bit of reliance on map design, or else she will take forever to charge it up. Which then takes us to her S3. This one has the same idea as Pepe's S3 in the sense of being a big bonk skill, but the way they execute it is very different from each other. How Zima does it is that her S3 will give her plus 100% attack and bonk the tile in front of her 5 consecutive times with an extended AoE range. Every bonk will do 240% of her attack as physical damage, and for each one she deals, S3 will additionally give her plus 30% attack. So basically she will start bonking the tile in front of her, and every new bonk will increase her attack even further until the skill ends. But the most unique part of this skill is the next effect. S3 will also buff her talent one, so the waves can travel even further to adjacent ranged tiles, with each bonk increasing the damage of the shockwaves by 3.5 times and giving them a 2-second bind effect. As a result, on S3 Zima can both increase her damage even further by having a mob to win a bunch of walls of all the extra attack she gains, as well as send the shockwaves to hit mobs very far away from where she is with enough walls. But as you can probably guess from her not being higher and me having no complaints about S2, this is where her issues lie. What you see on screen now is how far Zima can send her shockwaves, and the number on each tile represents how many hits she needs to deal to start hitting that far. The issue here is that even though her reach is very big, S3 will always deal 5 hits. You can't even buff her attack speed to make her hit even more, since that's a set value on the skill. As such, a lot of the tiles that Zima can reach will only receive 1 or 2 of her shockwaves. By itself this wouldn't be that big of a problem, but then we have the next issue, which is the fact that, as I said before, the waves only travel by walls or ranged tiles, so S3 is completely reliant on map design to be able to reach its full range. But the biggest problem here is actually with Zima's damage. Not only is that also tied to map design, since the amount of ranged tiles around her bonk area can affect her total damage, but her range itself is really bad. You might look at the image I showed you before and think it's very good, but remember, this is just a map of how far her shockwaves can travel. The true range of her bonks is much smaller, and and only reaches as far as the H-styles around her hammer hits, which gets even worse because of her archetype. Zima is a nerf shaker, so all this area you see around her hammer is bonking is simply the AoE of her hits, which deals much less damage than the main attack. If you want Zima to deal the full damage of her hit, you need the main target to be right where she's hitting, meaning that her actual true range to deal full damage is just the one tile in front of her. If you try to use it against anything that's not on it, you'll notice a severe drop in total damage, which is honestly funny because this is very similar to the problem Pepe has on her S3. An absurdly huge splash area, but she needs a target in front of her. Zima actually has an advantage over Pepe here, since her attacks do come out regardless of if she has a target or not, and she also has a much faster skill cycle, but to compensate she also deals much less damage per S3. This skill is overall good, but because of all those issues it ends up feeling a bit lacking in a lot of cases. Mostly because of what I said about she dealing just 5 hits and only achieving the massive range right by the end of it. That's honestly a bit too restrictive for a skill that already needs aligned walls to send her shockwaves. Zima overall is a good op, and her S2 being so great is why I'm ranking her above Bellone, but because the other ops in front of her do have an overall higher ceiling, I ended up not placing her that high relative to them. If you don't have the broken AFK ops like Chalter or Pianos, I would actually rank her higher. Probably 1, maybe even 2 spots if you really value AFK, since her S2 is just so good for that, but overall this is where I'd place her for everything else. Would only recommend pulling her if you really want that AFK power or just really like Zima. He's just standing there.
Menacingly. Okay. I'm gonna go.
No. Get here. Get back here. Alright. Oh!
いくつかアイデアがあるんだけど、かけり虫頼んだわ。
Next we have Orchid
かけり
Alter.
虫頼んだわ。苦しみを忘れたことはありません。こういう状況への対応策はとっくに用意してあるわ。
She's the latest released op this video will cover, and a very interesting one to talk about since Orchid is anything but straightforward in the way people usually evaluate characters, reason why she was somewhat of a difficult one to rank here. And it all starts with her archetype. Orchid is a heavy shooter. In terms of keeping with the archetype's theme, you could say Hypergriff did a great job in keeping her in line with both Schwartz and Posse while also making her arguably the strongest out of the 3. And you can already see that on her first talent. What it does is simply make so after you use a skill for the first time after deployment, she'll increase the attack of the next 50 attacks to 115%. This is basically free damage while also clearly being another take on Schwartz's first talent. It's nowhere near as strong as Schwartz's as you can see on screen, since not only she has a higher multiplier on top of also reducing defense, but the mid so Orchid has no RNG whatsoever, so she is much more consistent. Having an attack limit might sound like a demerit to some people, but you'll see later that it really doesn't matter for Orchid, which is how we get to her answer.
こういう状況への対応策はとっくに用意してあるわ。相手の弱点部位は見抜いて仕事の悩みは一旦忘れて。作戦会かける虫頼んだわ。相手に集中して終わらせましょう。仕事の悩みは一旦忘れて。いくつか一旦忘れて。
It's an extremely simple skill as you can see. All it does is let her store 4 charges, and once you use one of them, Orchid will fire 4 arrows that deal 160% attack each. But if you have an additional charge when activating it, and there are still mobs inside her range that didn't die to the first barrage, you'll automatically use a second one with 5 arrows that will also do 200% of attack instead of the previous 160%, with each having a 20% chance to stun. So basically she shoots some arrows, and if there is still something alive after it, she shoots some stronger arrows that can also stun. And Hypergriff also decided to add more QL to it by making so Orchid will auto-activate S1 in case she hits the charge cap and the mob enters her range, which is not hard to happen since S1 has an extremely cheap 4 SP cost. A lot of people look at this auto-activation and think this is meant to be an AFK skill, but that's really not the case, mostly because if we do analyze it as an AFK skill, S1 is just not good. And the main issue it has in that aspect is that Orchid will only attack 1 mob per charge instead of being AoE like the top AFK skills we have. For example, from Zima like we've seen before. This wouldn't by itself make the skill bad, but then you have the other problem it has as an AFK skill, which is the downtime between procs. Like I said, the skill only auto-activates once you hit your charge cap, so Orchid will always have these pauses between her attacks that combined with the one target limit per charge make S1 very ineffective to use in a lot of situations. You can of course still do it, it's not like it's impossible, but I wouldn't really replace anyone I already use for AFK with her. Where S1 really shines is actually as a high skill ceiling heli drop option. It might not look like that from just its effects, but this is where her talent 2 and module come in. What talent 2 does is decrease her redeploy time by 15 seconds and makes so when you undeploy Orchid, her DP will not increase like every other op does, on top of also leaving behind this blue flower thing. The flower makes so when you deploy her again inside the area you see on screen around it, Orchid will both get plus 15% attack for 30 seconds, and if there is a ground tile inside that area, you'll also be able to deploy her on it. The module just further buffs all the previous effects I mentioned, but most importantly it also gives Orchid an additional redeploy time reduction of 25 seconds. And from this you can probably understand what her gameplay is like. She takes the fast redeploy module heavy shooters have and cranks it up to 11 with that talent, to a point where she's actually more comparable to a fast redeploy sniper than anything else, so you can basically think of her as a 6-star April. And this is why I said S1 works better as a heli drop skill. When you combine the fast redeploy, extra attack from dropping her close to the flower, and extremely cheap SP cost, S1 heavily incentivizes you to undeploy her at least a few times when you bring it into a stage instead of making Orchid sit on the same spot for 5 minutes. And when you know how to use it, it can be surprisingly efficient at what it does, being the only skill in her kit that's capable of soloing 7-18 for instance. You can even go watch it on my channel if you're interested in that. But as you can probably guess, that also makes so it's a pretty hard skill to use efficiently. And I really don't think the general player base can really take advantage of it, especially because its value is very easy to be lost if you already have a more solid team that can easily clear most stages. So S1 is more of a niche option in her kit, which then takes us to the best Orchid skill, S2.
いくつかアイデアがあるんだけど、聞く？作戦会議は必要？さっさと終わらせ、こういう状況への対応策はとっくに用意してあるわ。さっさと終わらせましょう。仕事の悩みは一旦忘れて。帰ってからも目の前の相手に集中する。いくつかかけり虫頼んだわ。
It's here that her kit really shines, since this skill takes advantage of everything you saw while being generally stronger than S1. What it does is make her take off and immediately fire 3 volleys of arrow at every target in her range, with the first dealing 3, second 4 and the last finishing with 5 hits for a total of 12 hits per activation, each having their attack increased to 180%. Then when she lands from the takeoff, she'll deal one final hit of 300% of her attack to the frontal area ahead of her. Orchid is also able to store 3 charges and will immediately use S2 once and you deploy her without consuming any SP, so you can take that as a bonus free skill. Like I said, this is the best skill in her kit, and the biggest reason is that it solves the main issue it might face on S1, that being the lack of AoE since she hits all enemies in her range. And speaking of it, it is quite a weird range since it ignores the frontal row ahead of Orchid. That might feel awkward to some people, but to compensate for that, she can reach 1 extra row ahead of her at least. Since it costs 20 SP instead of 4 like S1, there are still some situations where I still can lose if you want to really optimize her gameplay, but overall this is an upgrade all things considered. And it's here that you can really feel what I said before about her basically being a 6-star fast redeploy sniper. Just like how April has her camo on S2, Orchid also has a way to protect herself in the form of takeoff. In case you don't know, since this is quite a rare effect on 6-stars, takeoff makes her ops untargetable by any mob that's walking on ground, so they're only reachable by flying enemies. Each S2 proc only lasts for 4.2 seconds, so she's not gonna be safe for that long, but it's usually enough for Orchid to do some really heavy damage and protect herself while the skill lasts. You can even toy around with some mechanics like the Steam Knight's barrage for instance, since he can't lock onto her while she's in the air. And another great thing about it is the amount of hits S2 has. It's very easy to gloss over it and just look at the total damage, but it just to proc those 12 hits in total. Meaning Orchid is really good against hit-based mechanics like the link event enemies or the heaters in Jessica's event, for instance. It isn't all flowers though, since S2 does have some issues. For example, damage. I'm not talking about her total damage, since 37k per proc is very good for a 20 SP skill, especially since you get one for free right after deploying her, so it's basically 74k damage right on demand. The problem with it comes with the fact that Orchid is much more of a short burst kind of character than someone like Wangsadel, for instance, who just has a very long cooldown skill but also does a billion damage in comparison. And since I know some people are incapable of realizing I'm not literally comparing Wangsadel's damage to Orchid's and saying she's bad because of it, maybe I should clarify that this isn't a problem in the sense that it's a weakness in her kit, but more so that when you combine it with her fast redeploy, relatively low time the takeoff lasts, and how her kit basically begs you to use her this way, Orchid really doesn't want to remain on field for that long, so she isn't as comfortable to use like Wangsadel or really most of the other snipers who can just stay on one spot. This isn't a hard rule of course, but you generally want her gone after just a few skills, even if it's just to refresh the flower and get more attack. All that makes Orchid quite a high maintenance character if you really want to take full advantage of her kit, which has actually been a common complaint I've seen on Chen, since a lot of people aren't very used to playing snipers like fast redeploys, especially someone like Orchid who also requires some spatial awareness and planning on where you want her flower to be for when you next deploy her. You can't just drop her on the map, keep her on the same tile forever and expect her to perform on the same level as other ops, so overall this is a great skill, especially if you know what you're doing, but it might feel like a pain to use if you don't want to try hard too much while playing. Which then takes us to S3.
頼んだわ。苦しみ忘れたことはありません。こういう状況への対応策はとっくに用意してあるわ。
This is the most niche skill in her kit, surprisingly. What it does is make Orchid start for 3 seconds, then after she's done it fires an arrow with infinite range on a straight line that deals 360% of her attack as physical and 60% as R2 all surrounding mobs for every set distance it travels, all while being able to store 2 charges. I've been comparing Orchid mostly to April until now, given how similar the base gameplay of Redeploy is, but this S3 is basically an Yato S3 copy. In case you don't know, Yato's skill works by making her travel forward while dealing damage roughly every 0.27 tiles, while Orchid makes her shoot an arrow forward that deals damage every 0.33 tiles. Because of that, this skill has basically the same ideal scenarios as Yato's, those being against mobs on a straight lines or giant enemies. Unfortunately, this is more or less where the good stuff ends. I don't want to extend this section more than I already did, so I'm not gonna beat around the bush, as 3 is pretty mediocre. The reason it's so good for giant bosses is that every tile they occupy will serve to increase the damage Orchid deals to them, but it feels like they balance the entire skill around this interaction, because if you put her against non-giant mobs, you'll see that the damage drops off really hard. It might still look like a lot to some of you, but remember that that's the entire skill damage for the next 25 seconds until she charges S3 again, and that you could be using S2 instead. On Yato this wasn't a big problem because she is a fast redeploy, so you usually can just drop her in the middle of a wave to shred most enemies and instantly retreat her, which is usually how most people use it. The giant boss interactions felt more like complements to that rather than the entire point of the skill. Orchid might be a fast redeploy like I said before, but this skill is a lot more awkward to use than Yato's in that area. First, because of the 3-second charge time. Not only does that give mobs time to move away, so it's harder to time it compared to just dropping Yato on them, but combined with the fact that she doesn't have invincibility like Yato, it's even possible for them to kill her depending on if you drop Orchid in a risky area. Of course, that is one of the reasons S3 has infinite range, so you can just deploy her safely away from mobs. But being a ranged op, it means Orchid usually has less tile options compared to ground units, since last time I checked, most mobs don't try to go over ranged tiles, so the fact that she only shoots in a straight line really restricts S3 if you want to hit mobs in a specific lane. Again, like with the survivability issue, you can go around this since Orchid can be deployed on ground, but to do that you first need to drop her once to then be able to redeploy her around that area, which adds another layer of annoyance just to be able to hit the thing you want. And after you manage to jump through all those hoops, you find that her damage is very lacking, especially against high defense since she doesn't scale that well with them. So especially when you compare it to S2, this one just feels a bit too gimmicky to use. It is nice to have, given how Hypergriff didn't stop making giant bosses, especially on IS, but it's still a bit lacking everywhere else. Overall, the Orchid is a very good op, which might lead some of you to ask why she's so low compared to the ones ahead of her. And the reason for that is actually very similar to Zima, but it's the opposite spectrum of that logic. Zima, like I said, is very good, but I only really recommend her for people who want another AFK skill, especially since she is replaceable by the ones you already have. Orchid also is very good, but like I've been explicitly saying this entire section, her kit only really shines when you put in the work to optimize her gameplay. So when compared to ops that already were great from the get-go without much effort, I think she holds less value comparatively if you don't want to sweat too much. Just like Zima, though, I also think she can climb 1 or even 2 tiers, but this time it's if you are willing to optimize her a bit more than the others. So it's up to you to decide here. If you want to do that, though, then Orchid is a very fun op to use and will definitely be a great addition to your account. Now you see them, since her dragon bounces off things, we put her here and put the boxes, she's gonna shred Teresa, right?
Yeah, that's a good area.
Go!
Wait, why did the dragon go to... Darn. Why is the box not blocking?
See, the box is not a wall, Jumbo.
What do you mean it's not a wall?
Next up we have Chen 3. She's the non-limited unit we'll get with the Chinese New Year banner, which is our half anniversary, and although she isn't as generally strong as the limited in her banner, her kit is still very busted, and the big reason for that is her first talent. What it does is extremely simple, as you can see. First, it just gives her plus 13% attack and attack speed, but it's this last part here that makes it busted. It converts all of Chen's attacks into weakness damage. This is a new damage type currently exclusive to Chalter that always switches the attack type of her hits to either arts or physical damage depending on which will do the most damage to the current enemy it's attacking. Basically, whenever one of her attacks is about to hit a mob, the game calculates a theoretical arts and physical value, taking into account all of the stuff you see on screen, and whatever is the highest will be chosen to hit the enemy. If this sounds very broken, it's because it is, since it allows Chalter to dynamically adjust her damage depending on the situation. And since it does the calculation for every hit, Chen can even be attacking multiple mobs at a time, but deal physical damage to some of them while dealing arts to others depending on what they're weakest to. Very reminiscent to what Sakako does with her nodes, but this time she converts all her damage instead of dealing half arts, half physical, so Chen can potentially be much better depending on the enemy you're facing. And to combo with her talent 1, we have the second talent. With her mod 3 it makes so when she doesn't take damage for 6 seconds, Chen Chalter will randomly recover from 50% to 200% of her attack as HP and guarantees a dodge for the next attack that hits her. It's a pretty good survivability option. The randomness might look a bit weird, but even in the worst case scenario where she recovers 50% of attack, that's still around 15% of her max HP and a guaranteed dodge. And because it's a guaranteed dodge, Alter Chen is completely immune to damage against enemies that attack slower than she can refresh it. It even pairs well with her Archetype's 1 block count, since she won't be blocking a ton of trash mobs that might deal cheap damage and cancel her talent. Of course, that's not very reliable, since the only mob type where you can consistently use this against are ones that attack as low as golems, but even if you don't take that into account, it is still a good talent for her to be able to heal during downtimes and guarantee dodge whenever the next mob reaches her. Which then takes us to the main skill in her kit, S3. This is by far the flashiest one here, and for sure the one you've seen her with if you ever watched the content about her. What it does is first expand her attack range to that of a lord, then it increases her target count to 4 and makes her attacks hit 3 times and deal 210% of her attack as arts damage. This is pretty standard guard multiplier stuff, and aside from her range, which is just plain bad compared to the other busted guards, it's honestly quite mediocre. But it's the next part that makes this skill so unique. Chen Chalter will also release a dragon on S3's activation, and every time it passes through a mob, it will either deal 6% of that mob's max HP or 580% of Chen's attack as arts damage, whichever is the highest value. This dragon looks almost identical to the one from Yu's event, but it works a lot differently in how it moves. Basically, whenever Chen's dragon hits a wall, blue or red box, it will turn 90 degrees to the right. So after she sends it out, it will keep moving forward until it eventually reaches a spot in the map where it starts looping the same route. And as I said, it does one hit hit when it goes through a mob, but every time it hits a wall, the dragon resets its counter and can hit the same mob again. So the strat here is to always try to find a position where your target is between multiple walls so the bounce will shred their HP. This is how you do the most damage with S3, since not only is the minimum multiplier here much higher than Chalter Chen's own attacks, but if a mob has a very inflated HP pool, it will be able to keep up since it deals 6% of the target's current HP as damage. In the best case scenario, which by the way is completely unrealistic to happen in 99.9% of stages since you need a mob to be between 4 tiles, she can do at least around 480k total damage. Assuming the dragon only hits for the minimum amount, which for reference is around 4 times more than Wilner, on a skill that costs 17 less SP, has a much quicker cycle and scales much better with attack buff since Chen has almost no attack increase in her kit. But like I said, this is not a realistic scenario, and it's here that I start listing the problems that make me not rank her higher, starting with her weakness damage. Like I said, this is a broken damage type that lets her convert arts into physical if that proves to be what will work best, and that's a big reason why Chen 2+1 is by far the strongest arts god in the game right now. She can just ignore almost any high res that the others can't, while having an even better range than all of them on top of being able to scale with HP. The issue comes when a mob has both high res and defense, and I should clarify that the problem isn't really the weakness damage by itself, but rather that probably because they gave her that, Hypergriff also made so her kit has no res or defense ignore. I mentioned how this mechanic is similar to Sakiko's notes before, and they even made it seem like Chen is better than her at it, but Sakiko has a talent that lets her ignore a lot of defense and res, so against high res and defense mobs, there's not even a competition on who is better. The other problem here is her dragon. I briefly mentioned what it is when comparing with Milner, but to be more specific, this thing is almost 100% map reliant on if it will be good or not. There is a pretty popular combo where you pair her with Nasty's S3 since her platform does count as a wall for the dragon to bounce, but the problem here is that 1, you need to set it up, which might be difficult or even impossible depending on the map, and 2, that even with Nasty, the dragon is still at the mercy of the stage since you can only drop 1 platform. This isn't like a reclamation algorithm where you can just stack on them to build your perfect setup, so you still need the map to help with its layout. And remember that 480k total damage I talked about? Well, if you don't account for the dragon, her total damage is just about 125k. Of course, just like how it's hard to find a perfect setup where a mob is enclosed between 4 walls, it's also pretty difficult for the dragon to never hit any mob. But the point here is that there's a very big gap between 125k and 480k, so the disparity in performance you might face from map to map can be very extreme. Yes, but she does that on a much worse range with no res and defense shred, while Minor just hits extremely hard to be able to go through most mobs' defense. After all that, some might even ask why she is still relatively high compared to the others, and that would be because even with those weaknesses, her base performance is still surprisingly great. The dragon is map reliant, yes, but it's pretty rare that it becomes 100% useless because even when it's not helping with her damage on one target, it can still sucker around huge portions of maps and deal with mobs no other op would be able to reach from her position. And unlike Orchid, for instance, she doesn't need much effort to work well, while not being really replaceable like Zima, since no other op has a literal dragon that can go around the map killing stuff while changing its damage type and scaling with HP. Couple that with what I said about her kit not having a lot of attack buffs, her fast skill cycling, and somewhat competent self-sustain, and she can actually perform very well in IS. She's not tier 0 in terms of efficiency for max difficulty clears, but it is still very easy to make her work, especially if you're not playing on the actual hardest difficulties there. And in general gameplay, you'll see her comfortably shredding from most maps thanks to her dragon's coverage potential. So it's definitely worth investing on Chen if you manage to grab her, which I think will happen to a lot of people considering who her banner partner is. Got something very important to show you. It's like the best feature enclosure in her entire kit.
Is it her feet?
It could have been, but it's also really good. It's only available on her S3 though. Now demo, I want you to look at her face.
I'm looking at her face.
Isn't that the brightest face you've ever seen?
Oh, is that what he's talking about?
Next one is closure.
一番過酷な任務を私に任せてくれれば
全て計算
今ここに伝説を呼びハニーアップルパイ私が来たんだあらゆる悪を一番時間は待ってくれますもうここは目を離す他のところ
She's another case of an archetype that's been left without 6 stars for years before coming back, with the last 6-star tactician being Mumu when Lontrey released. And just like Zima, Closer is somewhat of an update on the archetype to make it more general. But before talking about her talents and skills, I actually need to mention her trait since her entire kit revolves around it. What it does is give her a device only deployable inside her attack range that once deployed will remain there until Closer leaves the field. This thing can block and attack mobs, with its range being dependent on what skill Closer is using. And we can already see how important this clanker is when you look at talent 1. The most important thing it does is make so every op you deploy inside this thing's range will also be considered another one of Closer's robots. That's huge because it means that any buff given by the skills to her devices will also affect the ops you deploy inside their range. But the most important talent in Closer's kit is the second one. It makes so when she is in the squad, without even needing to deploy her, your minimum DP will be reduced by 5 when you get her mod 3, and gives all Rhodes Island ops plus 8% attack. The extra stats are more of nice bonuses, and the mid is in that minus 5 minimum DP decrease. What that means for anyone who is confused is that instead of being unable to deploy stuff when you reach 0 DP, you can instead go into depth with Closure and go to minus 5 DP instead. There is a debuff when you go into that state where your DP gen speed will be reduced by a bit, but that's overall meaningless since Closure herself can easily bring you back up to positive DP with any of her skills. So with basically no real downside, you get a much stronger version of Texas as initial DP talent since it works for the entire of the battle on every op you deploy. It's almost as if you got 5 DP reduction talents for free just for bringing Closure with you. And when you get to S2, which is her main skill for general content, it gets even better.
全て計算
今ここに伝説を呼びハニーアップルパイ私が来たんだあらゆる悪意一番や時間は待ってくれますもうここは目を離そうかなと
What it does is immediately grant you 10 DP, gradually generates 15 more over the course of it, gives her reinforcements plus 60% defense and 1 block count, gives Closer plus 80% attack, lets her attack 2 mobs at once, as well as attack anyone in the range of her reinforcements. This is the big buffing part of the skill, and it already takes full advantage of everything you've seen up until this point. The DP gen, like I said, more than makes up for any depth you might be in. Although when you do the math, you'll see that it's nowhere near as good at generating it as ops like the Flex for instance. Mostly because of the very long skill duration, which makes the cycle very slow, but a long duration is justified because of the other effects in it. Mainly the plus 60% defense and extra block count she gives to her reinforcements, since if you remember her talent, those buffs will also be granted to every op inside the 3x3 range this thing has on an S2. So on top of the DP, Closure can also buff everyone and deploy there for the skill's 30-second duration and help them with damage thanks to her also attacking anyone they block. All this would already be pretty good, but there's one last effect I still didn't mention, which is the fact that whenever you deploy anyone inside the robot's range while S2 is active, she'll refund 40% of the DP used when doing it. This effect takes this skill from good to potentially broken depending on how you use it. If we just look at it without any specific op combo, it turns any op you deploy in their range into a better charge of Vanguard, since the trait of that archetype refunds all the DP used to deploy them when retreating, which is usually halved for normal ops. But this 40% refund immediately gives part of their cost on deploy, so you can easily use it, and when added with the 50% refund on retreat, it almost matches the Chargers, so with just a small 10% difference you get access to 40% of their cost earlier. The second thing it does is vastly increase how much DP Closure gives per skill, since you'll always get more of it if you deploy someone in the range. In fact, you only need to drop around 30 DP to make this skill have the same DP per second ratio as Silex S1 for instance, so if you just deploy something like Sakeko and Dex, you'll already be getting more DP than a flag while also giving them Closure's buffs. But if you want, you can push this effect even further by either deploying more ops or using one of her combos. Without going into too much detail for the sake of time, basically when paired with Chalter, Bagpipe and Silver Chalter, you can exploit how their skills combine with each other and effectively get as much DP as you want to deploy your ops. Well, then we get to the main strength of this effect being so general, which is the fact that you can adapt it to work with basically any account. You can even just use Bagpipe for a weaker but still very good version of this combo, since she both gives free initial SP, and because being a charger Vanguard means you get 100% of the DP used when retreating her plus 40 extra for dropping her on Closure's range, so you can just bring her for the initial SP and then immediately retreat her to get a net positive of 5 DP to help deploy more ops. Or if you don't want to use that, you can even just bring a flag with with her, and just those two together with her DP depth would still give more effective DP faster than multiple of the top tier DP batteries we have right now, all while granting extra defense, block count and 15% damage reduction to everyone in that area. Really, the only major weakness of this skill is what I've been repeating for a while now, about this only working inside that area. 3x3 is not a bad range, but it does limit where you can deploy your team while on stage if you want to take full advantage of it. Like I said before, though, it doesn't take much for it to reach a flex DP generation, so you can still take a lot out of it while balancing where you deploy your ops throughout the stage. The other weakness is more of an archetype's weakness, and that's the fact that you can't undeploy her thingy after dropping it, so depending on the stage you might feel like it's just getting in the way more than helping after the start. This isn't a big issue, since as the map reaches the end you usually don't care as much about DP generation compared to the start, so you can just undeploy her, but then you do lose her buffs. Overall though, this is a very good skill for the majority of content we have. It just feels a bit lacking on IS, but that's because Vanguards in general aren't that great in the latest edition, since you have so many ways of getting DPs and maps usually don't pressure you much at the start. That's why the best ones in there are usually the Vanguards that don't act like normal Vanguards, like Silver Chalter. But because she is such a great unit in such an universal specialization, that being DP gen, I'm ranking her this high. The only reason she's not higher is because the ops ahead of her are so unique and irreplaceable in what they do that their base performance is even more broken. But if you do manage to get closure, she's definitely worth investing in.
全て計算
今ここに伝説を読み
雪が
いいアップルパイ私が来たんだあらゆる悪を一番時間は待ってくれますもうここは目を離他のところ
You would know if you played the story demo.
I wanted to just see this. Okay. Oh, on the bottom you see all her past incarnations. That's cool. You got the
It's her past lives.
Also as like the Dune lady, then the Calcid the butler.
Yes. Yeah, that time I was reborn as a maid. That time I was reborn as a handsome guy, as a handsome girl, and that time I was reborn as a wanderer.
Like, yeah, past life isekai, you know, top tier.
It's just changing clothes, then. Up next is called
治療の準備負傷者の保護治療の準備はできるアークナイトプロトコル
After years of being left behind by the content scaling a bit too much for her, even getting power crapped by herself, she finally got her deserved altar. And her kit starts with Talent 1. Like Chalter, Chen Chalter altar, it's a very simple looking talent but has a very broken effect in it. The more basic stuff is that she gets plus 25% max HP and defense and plus 1 block. The extra stats are very good because of how high they are, and the extra block might look weird considering she's a medic, but it all makes more sense with the main effect of this talent, which is that after you deploy Calcid, she will immediately take off and never leave that state. In case you skipped the Orchid section and doesn't know what that is, take off is a state where an op can't be blocked or targeted by mobs on the ground, only being reachable by flying enemies and a few environmental hazards. The same effect Lazy's altar has that lets her aura farm so well. So just like Lazy, Cal is unreachable by the vast majority of enemies in the game. But unlike Lazy, who is basically paperweight when her skills are intact, Cal can still heal her ops on this state. Not only that, but her talent 2 also gives her more utility since it makes so whenever an ally enters her range, she'll grant them 1 shield and a buff that restores 50 HP for 30 seconds. This talent 2 is actually pretty minor all things considered. The shield is a nice effect since it completely negates any attack, which can be used more strategically against stronger mobs, and the healing lasts for so long that it actually ends up restoring a respectable 1.5k HP for free, which does help her healing. But in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing that crazy unless you actually plan a strat around it. But then we get to her S2, which is where her kit starts getting more interesting. What it does is expand her range to this weird shape you see, gives her plus 150% attack, gives her 10 ammo, and makes so her attacks become bombs with an explosion radius of 1.5 tiles that when hit any mob will both deal 380% of her attack as true damage, heal every ally inside it by 200% of her attack, as well as inflict slow on every mob in its blast radius for 5 seconds. And she can also just spend her ammo to heal her ops, but she'll only do that if there aren't any mobs in range. This is arguably the strongest true damage skill in the game, not because it deals the most damage, there are other ops who beat her in that aspect, but more so because of how true damage is treated by Hypergriff. The way they balance the fact that this is the strongest damage type in the game since it can go through anything is by always making it deal less total damage than the other types when you don't consider defense and res. And since most Sixters can brute force their way through general content with arts and physical, they do end up performing better damage wise. That's why the best true damage skills are always the one that do more on top of it, with the best current example on the end being Monster. Her S3 does true damage, but it's also one of the best sources of burst healing in the game that can be changed to outside her attack range, not to mention its ridiculously low cost on top of all the buffs she already gives. Cal has basically the same SP cost when you take Monster's attack interval into account, since her skill is offensive recovery. Both her single target damage and burst healing are lower, but she can more than make up for that with the extra utility in it. Instead of having a target cap like Monster, the splash damage allows her to hit a much larger number of mobs per attack, which can end up meaning more total damage in the end, and her crowd control is an 80% slow that she can perma apply as long as she keeps hitting the same targets, so she has a slightly weaker version of most teams S3 on top of all the damage and heal, not to mention how she can just deactivate her skill for better cycling. Also remember that throughout all this, Cal is immune to almost any form of damage because of her takeoff, so as a true damage skill, leaning so much into the utility of it while only sacrificing a bit of the damage really does help a lot, and Cal can very easily win against Monster in a lot of cases if you do need that. Obviously this isn't to say she is a better Monster, since a lot of Monster's value comes from her being a very good universal buffer, especially when you consider Monsters as 2, but being able to be competitive in the true damage portion is a very good start. Things get even more interesting with her S3 though.
一番全域中今ここに伝説を蘇らせようバカ持ってる
What it does is once you activate S3, it'll give her plus 150% attack, reduce her attack interval and let her heal one more target, so the usual big numbers buffs. But the meat of this skill is in this portion. S3 will also grant you a zero cost deployable. This thing lets you instantly move Chalter from where she is to whatever range tile in the field you want, as long as that's not inside Cal's current range. And when you do that, you'll take the last two ops deployed inside her attack range with her and allow you to deploy them anywhere inside her range in the new position for zero cost. This is a very broken support effect, because the game doesn't just treat these new deployed ops as having moved. It's essentially as if you hadn't deployed them, waited the whole cooldown period and deployed them again. So when they come out, they'll have all the initial SP their skills grant them, meaning that this skill is basically an upgraded version of Chalter's S3. Cal won't be able to deal any damage or give the plus 4 SP Exu can, so that's the main difference between the two. But in return she can bring one extra op out, works on ranged ops, something Exu can't do, and allows you to take them to very far away tiles, while Exu is limited to only deploy inside her range. Some might think this is an Exu power creep, but it's the complete opposite, as Cal now allows for one of the strongest and most fun combos in the game when paired with Exu, since you can constantly redeploy the same op over and over again while having almost zero downtime between their activations. The most popular combos I have seen are with Hoshiguma Alter and Surters, since they are pretty famous for retreating after the skills are over and their uptimes do last for very long, so you can essentially always have their skills running. But you can do this with basically anyone you want. It gets even more interesting when you take Exu out of the equation though, since like I said you can pick 2 ops instead of 1, which opens an infinite amount of combos for you to try in various different scenarios. Chalter is just a phenomenal op that can both give insane utility and open dozens of different combos, while also being able to help on the offensive side and provide tons of debuffs for you to use against enemy mobs, all but while having an infinite takeoff effect that essentially makes her immortal against 90% of the stages in this game, which is why I'm ranking her on the top spot together with the next op. Her position was honestly the hardest to pick when making this list, least. But given the fact that Cal doesn't compete with him in any aspect, so you can generally just fit them together to cover different areas and even combo both, which by the way is one of the best combos with her right now. And how she is a support, which historically tend to age a lot better than DPS, especially when they have such universal coverage like her, I do think you can justify placing both together. It's just that DPS ops are always 100 times easier to sell, since the top ones usually just nuke entire maps on their own, so the average player will just look at that and be naturally drawn to it over the support kits. Either way, even if you don't consider her to be on the same level, it is still recommended you save for a call after the Chinese New Year banner.
神はいずこにも見出せぬものです。どうせもう安心してせ
安全体を見よ。勝敗は一。白の闇に戦に溺れる。お前たちには進歩はないな。
Let's see how Dorothy does.
This is not Wang. Where's my Wang?
Yeah, look at her damage demo. Oh my goodness.
That's great. Let's keep deploying the mines, okay?
Oh my, look at her damage demo.
何に言わずとも辛抱殿。
You
結果を
forgot.
変えて
You
し
just
ま
need
え
to
る
give
も
her
の。
like deploy those critical mines, okay? Let's see look how much damage she'll can.
Oh? Oh my
See, that's like-
goodness. How do you think? How close do you think he's gonna be to Dorothy?
Pretty close, you know. Dorothy was kind of busted for quite a while.
ここで負けを認めろ。まだ見苦しい。
See, look, you barely damaged this guy. No, hey, hold on a moment. I guess you can do a bit more. Oh, you can free up. Are you? That feels like cheating, man.
Lastly on the list, then we have
た
Wang.
だ私の好みだけは逃れられない。
He's probably the OP people are expecting the most, given both his lower importance as well as how strong he is. And just like Chalter, Chen, Alter, there's really only one skill that I'm gonna talk about, which is his S3. But first we really need to talk about his talents, because without them that skill would not be as broken as it is. The first one is pretty worthy, but it's basically the thing that gives him his mines, since Wang is a trap master like Dorothy or Ella. There's a very big distinction in how his mines work though, since hyperglyphs try to represent how he's supposed to play Go with his pieces. The end result is a powerhouse you can bring into 99% of stages just for random bullshit in any order you want in the most brain-dead way possible and still get results. But there was an attempt either way. As a result, for an OP that's so easy to use that you can just spam his pieces on the same tile and still kill half of the map, there's a surprising amount of depth to how they work. But since this isn't his dedicated video, I won't go into too much detail. The TLDR is that whenever you deploy one of his pieces, Wang will summon a duplicate of that piece in one of the 4 adjacent tiles following this priority list you'll see on screen. The most notable thing here is the fact that he can summon the duplicate even on top of undeployable tiles. The only places where they can't be dropped are on top of blue and red boxes, holes, or on tiles occupied by your ops, but overall there's almost zero chance you'll ever see him unable to throw his duplicate. And it's important that they are side by side because of 2 things. The first is that unless a piece is connected to another at least once, they simply don't function. You can simply connect a piece to another once, then get rid of either one of them, and both will work normally. Or even keep a dysfunctional one there to then drop another close to it and activate it later, but these pieces need to connect to another one at least once after being deployed, or they'll just be bricked until you do so. The second reason why this is important is actually because of his second talent. When you unlock his mod level 3, it makes so when they are linked, for every piece that's part of that chain, they'll all ignore 12 res and get 13% increased damage, stacking up to 3 times. So basically the more pieces you connect, up to 3, the more res ignore and extra damage disconnected pieces get. These interactions are important for both his S1 and S2, but it's on S3 that you really see it taken to the extreme, which is how we finally get to how it works. Basically, S3 changes his pieces to have this massive range you see on screen. Not only that, but it also makes so mobs don't need to step on them like the other skills to trigger, just entering the blast radius is enough. And lastly, it also changes their effect to make so when exploding, the pieces will deal 380% of his attack as arts damage to every mob in range. And this is only what happens passively to the pieces, but once you activate it, S3 also gives Wang some extra effects. First, he stops attacking, which is whatever since his personal damage is negligible negligible compared to the pieces, but then he also gains this massive range extension you see and immediately gains 8 pieces, and for any amount you gain from this effect that exceeds his piece cap, which is 7, will be immediately deployed in random spots inside that massive range. But the most important effect here is the next one. Wang will gain 20 ammo and upgrade the first talent, so on top of the 1 duplicate he drops when you deploy your pieces, he'll now drop an additional 3 in the formation you see on screen. And for each one of these additional 3 he drops, Wang will consume 1 ammo. Lastly, whenever you either run out of pieces or manually deactivate this skill, all the ammo that was left will be returned to you as pieces. Maybe it sounds a bit complex because of all the effects it has, but basically he deals a ton more damage on a much bigger area, and the duplicate pieces his talent summons are now quadruple pieces if you deploy them inside his range. This skill is so absurd that it's almost hard to explain how broken it is. First we have the damage. Like I said, the pieces do 380% of his attack hazards when they explode. This is quite literally the best way to calculate their damage and a very deliberate design choice, because there isn't a single source of attack increase in Wang's kit to affect Astri's numbers, meaning that he synergizes perfectly with any form of attack buff that comes from outside his kit, like Monster's Crystal or Nasty's Platform for instance. And it also pairs really well with Shu's talent that gives him extra attack and SP if you have 4 Su in your squad. Not only that, but the way he drops 3 additional pieces also synergizes perfectly with his talent too, and makes so you can always get the extra 39% increased damage as well as the 36 res ignore as long as you have enough tiles to deploy them. In fact, they deal so much damage that even without activating his S3, the pieces are already broken, and you can simply use them freely when he's on downtime to even deal with elites, and then we have him refunding his ammo. This is another busted aspect of S3 because Wang isn't like Dorothy who passively gets more mines over time. The only ways for him to get more pieces are on deploy, once he activates S3 and once it's deactivated. So by tying the amount he gets back from S3 ending to how much ammo he has left, and give him 20 of it when his cap is 7, gives you a lot of freedom between deploying it all inside his range to deal a ton more damage but then get none back, or deploy some outside of it so it doesn't use as much ammo to then guarantee you get a bunch once S3 ends. All these things, the absurd damage with built-in res ignore, great synergy with some of the best buffers, easy access to a reliable way to refund his pieces, and the freedom you have to deploy them almost anywhere in the map make Wang one of the current strongest ops in the game. His damage potential and the capacity to scale with enemy stats are unmatched by almost every other op, and he has been used in almost every piece of difficult content since his release to great effect as the most efficient option. Wang can affect the entire field in an extremely flexible way to a degree that no other op can match. He still has his weaknesses, of course, like every op has. For example, being a bit map dependent, since if you can't connect his pieces they won't get the max damage boost. Another thing is his survivability, since if you take all of the strongest ops in the game characters, those being Wangsadel, Exo and Tragodia, all of them have a way to either protect themselves from damage or heal themselves. Wang not only doesn't have any of that, but he also has very low defensive stats, so he is very easy to kill. Overall though, you won't feel any of these weaknesses in 99% of the content in this game. Even in hardcore content like ISD-18, this is very easy to work around. Rather, these are more of deliberate weak points Hypergriff left there in case they want to counter him, which given how Wangsadel can still trivialize 99% of the content in the game 2 years after her release, I don't think they are very interested in doing. And because of that, I'm ranking him right at the top. At a base level, Wang is a monster that can trivialize most of the content in the game, and if you learn to use him well instead of blindly spamming his pieces everywhere, he just becomes an abomination. So it's very recommended you pull for him if you care at all about meta. And this is the list. I tried to pick what I think most general players would want in an op, but of course since Arknights is such a big game with a bunch of different modes and playstyles, it's obviously impossible to take everything into account. Especially since I'm talking to both people who play since release and have 7+ year old accounts, as well as others who started playing maybe a month ago. Which is why you have ops like Zima and Orchid, or I made a point to say they could be higher depending on what you want. The op you should take with the biggest grain of salt is Orchid, since she is the most recently released one, so it didn't have that much time compared to the others to see how she performs in more modern events, but since she's a sniper I do have more confidence talking about her kit. Overall, don't really take any of this as gospel, especially if you don't always go for meta efficiency and easy to use ops, but you can still use this as a general guideline and to at least familiarize yourself with their kits to decide if you want to save for them. If you want to ask more about these ops or just use .pic though, I suggest you join my Discord server. And if you want to support me, get early access to videos, use Discord perks or if you appear on a Blana special place, you can also consider becoming a member. I'll also think you're really cool if you do that. That's it then.